Good morning, dear ladies. Today we are going to start discussing Thomas Gray and the New Graveyard Spirit. Dear ladies, we have already discussed Thomas Gray as one of the graveyard poets who started to include the sentimental element in their poetry, dealing with the issue of death, but in a different way from the neoclassical poets in their dealing with death. In their dealing with religious issues, emphasizing the issues that articulate the stories about Christ and his sacrifice. As we approach the middle of the 18th century, the English literature, although it was emphasizing the formative accuracy, started to discuss issues that are no more topical or moralistic in tone. That means the issues discussed in the English literature tended now to be away, or at least not very emphasizing the instructional attitude or moral messages, as it was attributed during the time of John Dryden and Alexander Pope as representatives of the neoclassical school. The neoclassicism was mainly articulating intellectual elements in their literary works, and these intellectual elements started to fade away under the German influence of the movement which was called the Sturm-und-Drang movement, storm and stress. This movement exalted nature, feelings, and human individualism and sought to overthrow the Enlightenment cult of rationalism. This movement in arts and in literature tried to discuss more issues like nature and articulate feelings and emphasizing human individualism at the expense of rationalism, which the Enlightenment age, or the Age of Reason, was making a cult of rationalism and reasonability and realism. And the most pioneer members, or the prominent members of this movement, were Goethe and Schiller. Now, if we reconsider the issue, that does this mean that the writers of the middle of 18th century skipped the traditional interest in Greek and Roman classics? No, they did not skip that influence. This interest did not disappear, but it started to be accompanied with a new spirit as well. What is that, a new spirit? The influence of sentimentalism, stemming from the religious shared compassion, shifted the interest from rationality, to emotions, and stressed on an emotional approach in writing. They did not. Now, the writers of this period also reserved their interest in the Greek and Roman classics, but they inject their works with some sentimental aspect, which we have already discussed, that it has stemmed from the religious or shared religious compassion. Okay, so now the interest shifted from pure reason to reason and emotions, to a stressed approach on to stressing an emotional approach in writing poetry and literature. And although this new spirit of using or articulating emotions in the poet's work, yet they kept their precise polished couplet. You remember that the form is very important for the neoclassical poets, and the intellectual tone is also important, but they didn't give up these 2 points, but they added the emotional aspect. The new spirit started to creep from the static and didactic tendencies the instructional, the teaching tendencies of the neoclassical started to have a new spirit of discussing feelings or feeling man's individualism. That man should be should also be discussed in reference to his individualism and to his liberty and the freedom. Sentimentalism brought the cult of sensibility. Now, sentimentalism, which was discussed in the neoclassical poetry, in the late neoclassical poetry, now added another cult, another, let's say, tradition of sensibility. What do we mean by sensibility? It means that we become aware of and responsive toward feelings and emotions. And the greatest representative English writer representative of sensibility is Thomas Gray. He believed that there is nobility of all mankind, and this nobility might have been prevented by man's circumstances to show itself to the surface. So he believes that each man has his own individuality, his own virtues and nobility. It is not only for the rich people who are characterized with this nobility. Okay, but sometimes our circumstances prevent us from showing this nobility and these virtues on the surface, and we are overlooked. We are not seen by others who are considered as famous or important in our society. Now, Gray, who is Gray? He was a very slow. How did Gray write? He was a very slow writer because he was always striving for perfection. And this is part of his neoclassical attitude, that neoclassical poets were striving for perfection in their form, in using elevated language. And when he wrote his elegy written in a country churchyard, it cost him about 7 years to finish. Because of his self-critical attitude, he used to revise his work more than once and change it more than once until it becomes, in his eyes, it becomes perfect. Though his literary output is rendered the less among his great contemporaries, although his work was very little, yet his works are accounted of the finest works written in the English language. Now we will talk about the elegy, his elegy written in a country churchyard. He wrote this poem in 1742. He was inspired by thoughts that he got after the death of one of his friends, the poet Richard West. So he started writing it in 1742, which means about 9 to 10 years before, 7 to 8 years before it was published. And the first version of the poem was titled "Stanzas Wrote in a Country Churchyard," not elegy. The second version, which had the title of "Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard," was published after many revisions, and he restrained the first 18 stanzas of this poem, of the first version, and then the last 4 stanzas were rejected and replaced by new stanzas. This is his self-critical attitude. The final version of the poem was completed in 1750, and it was published in 1751. Now we have to know what is an elegy. An elegy in Greek means to lament, to mourn. It is a solemn and formal lyric poem about death. It may mourn a particular person or reflect on a serious and tragic theme, like the passing of youth or losing beauty. So it is either mourning a particular person, or it represents a discussion of a serious or tragic theme, like losing our beauty, losing our youth, and all these things, or maybe losing justice, losing heroism, and like these issues. By mourning a person, when we mourn a person, the poem is going to elevate him and make him public. Now, is this the purpose of Thomas Gray in writing this elegy? We have to know, why did he choose the elegy form in presenting his poem? The literary form, what are the features that are very important about the elegy that makes him choose the elegy form, the elegy genre, instead of choosing any other genre in showing his poetry, in writing his poetry? The form of elegy renders itself to contemplation and reflection. This is the main point, that Gray chose the elegy form in order to show his contemplation, his overthinking about some issue. Gray's intention was not to elevate a certain person. He was not intended to make his his friend, the poet, the dying poet, public, or he honors him in this elegy. The purport of Gray's elegy is of meditation on the lives of the ordinary people who are now buried in the churchyard. So this is the main point. This is the main issue. This is the main content. The purport is the content of his elegy, is that he wanted to contemplate and meditate on the lives that these ordinary people were living before they are now buried in the churchyard. He contemplates the obscurity into which death will overwhelm us all. He also contemplates, or he thinks over, the unrecognized paths through which death will overwhelm us, take us into its realm. The destiny of all men is death. The recognized and the unrecognized. The recognized, the poor, the rich people, the famous people, leaders, politicians, poets, literary men who are recognized and known by all people, and the obscure and the unknown people are all equal in the process of diving into the realm of death. This is his purpose. Now we have to look generally to the poem. The poem is a halfway poem between neoclassical poetry and romantic poetry. We have taken neoclassical features, and we will see through our discussion of the stanzas, we will see some elements that are related to neoclassical poetry and some elements are related to romantic poetry. It is typically a pre-romantic poem. It is a transitional poem. Gray was much interested in the history of English poetry, showing himself as a good example of the way where imagination and scholarship reinforce each other. Gray has read a lot about the English history. He has a good knowledge about the history of or the historical development of the English poetry, and he reached a conclusion that imagination and the scholarship reinforce each other. We cannot make poetry great or remarkable by using only imagination or by using only scholarship and knowledge. We have to make a blend between these two elements in order to get great poetry, because they reinforce each other. He tended to shift the poetic taste and widen the literary horizon beyond the boundaries of Augustan assurance. Ladies, Gray was intended to do what? He wanted to widen, to expand the literary horizon, which was based on the Augustan assurance, formative, topical, moral assurance. He wanted to add some other taste to his writing and to other poets' writings in order to make this blend successful and informative. The whole poem, of course, he is going to do this through this elegy. The whole poem is said to give a sense of personal emotion, universalized by form. So there is personal emotion and form. Emotion, which represents imagination, emotional side, sentimental side, sensibility, and they are all put in the accurate form, just like the neoclassical. So emotion is related to romanticism, and form is related to neoclassical. Now we have to know in the poem, where is the neoclassical? First of all, the neoclassical points or elements in the elegy appears where, number one, in its polished expression of ideas and use of balanced phrases and sophisticated vocabulary. We know, ladies, we have already known that neoclassical school emphasizes the use of accurate vocabulary, well formed language and elevated language, and we will see this in the elegy. So it reserves this neoclassical element. Also, it keeps the other element, which is the elevated language, confirming thus the neoclassical poetic diction. So it emphasizes vocabulary, sophisticated vocabulary, balanced phrases, and a good expression of ideas. Adding to this, it is the elegy is also adherent to the neoclassical poetic diction. Now, but still, yet it seems to have romantic elements also. In which aspects? Number one, the poem shows a new interest in nature. We are going to see from the very beginning of the poem that there is a good interest in nature, using nature as a landscape, just like the romantic poets. And number two, there is a new interest in humans' individualism, as we said, when the poet shows an interest in the life of the common folk, of the trodden people, of the obscure, unrecognized people. And number three, the poem highlights feelings and expression of emotions. It also emphasizes feelings, emotions, and the expression of imagination, expression of emotions, and not restricted to reality and intellectuality. Now, the elegy is distributed into three parts. The first part, as we said, it shows primarily the interest in nature. It includes 4 stanzas. The poet contemplation of the landscape, making a reference to the signs that foreshadow that. Sorry, ladies, here it is that foreshadow the idea of death and man's mortality. So part 1 is the introductory part, which sets or which articulates the setting of the poem, time and the place, and using nature as a landscape. Of course, nature is related to the graveyard. In part 2, it is discussing the consideration of short and simple annals of the poor and the obscurity of the poor's destiny. Now, in part 2, he's going to discuss the life of the common folk, and it shows, and the poet shows in this part his consideration of the simple ways that the poor can get, the simple opportunities that the poor can get, and that's why they become obscure. And obscurity is the thing that draws their destinies. In part 3, depending on part 1, the writer is going to reach a conclusion, which is the moral idea, and which arises from the discussion of part 2. And then there is the epitaph, in which the writer or the poet, Thomas Gray, returns to his own self and contemplates his own situation as a poet, as a human being, and how he's going to go through his, let's say, trip of death.